Thank you. And we're here to give a really kind of interim beginning stage report on work we've been doing at the University of Lincoln around institutional change and decolonising not just the curriculum and pedagogy, which I think has been the focus of a lot of decolonial journeys so far, but also how we can kind of bring some of those decolonial debates into dialogue with other parts of the institution. And if you think about that, we come from what are quite often seen as, if not different, then sometimes opposing teams at the institution. It's really lovely that decolonising brings you into contact with people you kind of don't necessarily have a lot to do with in other parts of your day-to-day life. So, Tracey, tell us about yourself. You're the human resources professional.
I am, yes. So, hi everybody. I'm Tracey Laing, Head of Organisational Development. We were, up until recently, the HR Human Resources Department. Recently had a change of name to Department of People, Performance and Culture. And yes, been doing quite a lot of work with Simon, as we'll come on to, around how we actually look to decolonise us as a function, to unpick some of our policies, procedures, different ways of working, etc.
My name's Simon Obendorf. I grew up in Lutruwita. I was educated on the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung people in Naarm, which in translation for many of you is I grew up in Tasmania and I was educated in Melbourne. I think it's actually nicer to talk about earlier traditions there. My work as a scholar has been in post and decolonial theory for a very long time, but I've recently been tapped to lead the Decolonising at Lincoln project, taking over from some of the work that's been done under a predecessor there. My work is largely around East and Southeast Asia and kind of decolonial work in gender and sexuality. But all of a sudden, I get thrust into this new role and I've got a new best friend in Tracey in talking about some of the work we might do in decolonising, not in my special area of academic interest, but in some of the institutional work that the university does. And that's really been an eye-opener for me. And I think one of the things that we've kind of learned is that it's very easy to talk about decolonising something as kind of concrete and specific as a curriculum. You've got a set of learning outcomes, you've got a reading list, you could do things there. Decolonising institutional culture, decolonising an institution is a much trickier sort of undertaking. So we've got kind of a few themes we want to think about for our part of today's session. One of those is what sort of institutions we are when we talk about decolonising an institution, because I think that really matters. I think the other thing we want to think about is kind of how we start to mainstream some of those ideas into institutional work and institutional change. The big question there is, where does decolonisation belong? How do we situate decolonial work? How do we tell that story to often sceptical, sometimes ignorant, sometimes well-meaning but not particularly well-equipped colleagues? And that really pushes to the third point that I want us to think about in today's session, and that's managing dissent and pushback around some of this work as well. So look, just quickly to give you the context we're working in at Lincoln. And unlike a lot of other institutions, we are an institution that is, I suppose, having to do a lot of the work to tell the story of why decolonisation is relevant. We come from perhaps the most Eurosceptic county in the country. We're also from the whitest county in the country. We don't tend to have in our institution a lot of push from a large, black or minority ethnic student group. We don't have large numbers until recently of international students pushing this. Our recruitment has tended to be not as diverse as many other institutions. So we've had to do the work to tell that story. We're a post-92 institution. We're a major economic contributor to our town and our county, but that also gives rise to some scepticism about our role. The classic town and gown distinction, but also the kind of this idea that the university is this alien presence that's now starting to bring all these new ideas and new folk, and goodness me, people are not white, into what has historically been a county that's been very comfortable, if not to say confident, in its own identity. As an institution, we've got a really strong commitment to WP, widening participation. We've had a lot of students who are first generation to university, but we're also working with a lot of the same sort of sectoral constraints that I know people from institutions around this room will have been working with. So that's about stuff like you making sure that our graduates are equipped for the world of work, that we are generating research income, that outputs are kind of ticking along, that we are very, very much dependent on fee income, student fee income. Increasingly, that's international student fee income, and on attracting and retaining staff. So in some ways, we're a university like any other in the UK. In other ways, we don't have the kind of the internal push towards decolonisation that other institutions might be able to work from and with. And that's really driven our decision at Lincoln to adopt a particular strategy. And I'm not saying this is the best way, I'm not saying it's not open to critique. But one of kind of the takeaway messages to think about is why we've chosen to situate it the way we have. First of all, we're taking a whole of institution approach, so that this isn't just the kind of the curriculum pedagogy chunk. We're also not situating decolonisation within EDI work. We're actually seeing EDI as something that needs to be decolonised in and of itself. That a lot of equality and diversity work is about putting different bodies in different spaces or different experiences in different spaces. It's not necessarily about kind of changing the value set of those spaces. And that kind of approach has really bled into a whole range of other things, which I'm not going to talk about today, but I'd love to talk to you about at some point. How we work with our operations and estates folk, how we capture student voice. There are colleagues from Lincoln here today from our library and collections who can have a chat to you about what's been going on there. We also have a really big project which is about reaching out into our local community and uncovering hidden histories called Reimagining Lincolnshire. But from an institutional change perspective, where we've situated decolonisation is under institutional value sets. We have a really strong statement of institutional values called One Community or One Community Values. There's a website you can go and look at if you're fascinated in that. And we've situated decolonisation in that realm, thinking about how we might shift our institutional values to being more cognisant of difference, of marginalisation, of previously obscured narratives, people and experiences. And that has led me to the fabulous Tracey Laing and the work of people, performance and culture. And I knew nothing. I'd kind of interacted with HR when I got the job, and then I'd kind of forgotten they existed. Sorry. And all of a sudden I thought, my goodness me, these people have such an important job in decolonising our institution, because they go out and advertise to the world about who should be in our institution. They onboard people into our institution, and they are responsible for kind of overseeing all these kinds of things here: people, performance, and culture, which is why it's in bright red. So I'm going to hand over there to Tracey. Just before I do, this is kind of the agreed statement. The other really nice thing doing this in institutional values, we've managed to get kind of buy-in from the VC down to push forward some of this project. And you'll see, working together, but not just scholarship, but interpersonal relations, professional practices, bringing all of that into the statement of what we do. So, Tracey, over to you. Tell us about what PPC does.
I will. Thank you, Simon. Okay, so just sort of building on from what Simon was talking about, way back when you came to talk to us within the management team and we started to have some of these conversations, the first thing I thought is this is a real opportunity for us to do that cross-working across the wider organisation. And I think one of the things we started to think about, why decolonise HR as it was then in terms of policies, procedures, principles, ways of working. And I think there's even that debate initially around that colonial language that we initially had around seeing humans as resources, and that was some of this kind of change in language of our department and how we position ourselves. And also, going back to the earlier presentation, thinking about how we unpick who we are and how we work,
and how things have been set up in our department. So I've worked within the now PPC function for 15 years, obviously seen a lot of change over that time. So some of the questions we're starting to ask ourselves as a function is, when things were written, when things were introduced, when certain processes evolved and ways of working and development, at that point in time, what were these brought in to do? Who did they benefit? Who did they exclude? So there is quite a lot about us unpicking ourselves as individuals. In terms of our department, I mean, there's about just over 40 of us now, and we're coming at this from really broad, different kinds of knowledge is what I would say. So one of the first things we did is we got Simon to come in and just talk about the subject, just to unpick it, the myths, because there's some colleagues within our department, this is their first job, some of them haven't come across the subject before, so some of them it's very new. Equally, we've got colleagues within the department who have worked more closely with the subject and are already starting to kind of look at their work through this lens. So that's been interesting within itself. Looking at this as a subject within our department, one of the things we're trying to think about is the role that we hold. And a lot of what we do now is influencing. And I think we need to balance that with power in terms of the decolonisation agenda and unpicking where do people think they hold power in certain roles, but equally the importance of influencing. And as Simon said, that's even, thinking of that right from onboarding, going further back around recruitment. What conversations are our colleagues even having with recruiting managers? We don't have the overall decision making and how we're recruiting into the university, but we do have the influence. And just the other week, Simon came in to talk to colleagues within our recruitment section within PPC around some of the questions that they may want to ask, even drilling down to some of the basics around, looking at job descriptions and various things. What language are we using? Who may we be disadvantaging, etc. And I'll come on to that. Yes, of course.
I had this kind of completely naive vision of what Tracey and her team did, which is I thought, okay, we'll write a new policy, we'll stick some decol objectives in there, bish bosh, job done. And then kind of Tracey says, actually, we're not in the room when most of these decisions are taken. It's heads of school, it's recruitment panels, it's a whole bigger range of actors. And that's really where we started to think about shifting those conversations, shifting that institutional culture, shifting our values is much, much more significant.
Yeah, definitely. And that sort of links on to the work we do through EDI and looking at things through that lens, but equally just trying to get colleagues within our department to ask some questions that they may not have asked before when interacting with people across the organisation and looking at things through a different lens potentially, which can be challenging when you're unpacking yourself as an individual and your background, etc., and also unpacking your role and the influence, etc. Within our department, we obviously have lots of other things that sometimes we actually have to adhere to around employment law and various things. So it's about balance. And I think some of that is that buy-in within the department in terms of actually we've got to be aware that some of the meetings I go to across the sector and we talk about organisational development and we talk about output and we talk about performance, and that's the kind of narrative that we're using. And obviously that does contradict some of this wider work we want to do when we think about individuals and different cultures and the work of co-creation and collaboration and things like that. So again, it's just us being aware that within our roles and then when we spread out across the sector, some of the other things that we're up against. And I think for us it's around how we bring that together, because the other challenge I have within the wider team is for some people, they see this as I've got more work to do now, you're giving me this. I need to get the basics right, and I'm getting pressure from recruiting managers or whoever it might be, and now I've got this other thing to consider. And that's where I think that narrative comes in around the language we use, the questions we ask, and that being part, of the wider picture. As I've said, there's a lot of diversity of knowledge within our team. We tend to find in professional services at Lincoln, most of us are recruited locally. A lot of us have lived in the county for many, many years.
I went to my first meeting and said, there's a lot of white ladies in this room.
Yeah, we don't have many men within our department. So, you know, there's various things that we need to consider. And are we, as the earlier presentation was talking about, actually, who are we speaking to? Where are we getting our knowledge from? A great opportunity in the university, because just in terms of our interaction and learning, just from an academic and professional services point of view, some of the things that we've come up with that we may not have considered without trying to bring those two, you know, agendas together to achieve what we're trying to do. One of the things I thought about is this is such a large area to think about. When I think about all the touch points of our department, and whilst I'm looking at the organisational development piece, I'm also working with managers across the wider function around all the touch points that they've got with colleagues across the organisation. And it is so broad. And I'll come on to some of the things that we've started to think about in terms of through practical terms. But I very much see this as a very big jigsaw, and we've got to start somewhere, and we've got to start thinking about some of those pieces. One of the challenging conversations we've had is when we think about these key processes and interventions, what is a priority? Can we say one is a priority over another? And we've had some interesting conversations around this. The reason we've started to talk about recruitment and development is because of that the conversations happening early on of colleagues we're bringing into the university, but equally how are we developing the colleagues that are already here. We want to do work around some of the other things around policies and things like that and language, but equally I think the most important part is our interactions with people. And also, Simon touched on this, differentiating our decolonial work done elsewhere in the institution. And again, we've had many conversations around this because we have a separate function that kind of look at EDI issues, but equally what we're trying to do is bring that into wider conversations and how we collaborate going forward, so all voices and experience, etc., are heard. Managing the pushback, I've touched on one of those. I think it can be hard for people because people who've got a lot of pressures sometimes see this, as I said, as something separate that's been added to the workload. So there's a big cultural change there to make that part of what they're already doing, and it just becomes part of that culture, etc.
Do we want to show the example of that at this point?
Yeah, we can do. I think it's the...
One of the things we did as part of this project was to think about the names we gave to our buildings in the university, almost all of which were about, you know, great white luminaries of Lincolnshire past, your Isaac Newton, Joseph Banks, these sorts of people. So we put a little tiny page, it's about the size of an A4 plaque, contextualising that individual that the building had been named after and their relationship to colonialism. And then one Welcome Week last year, we ran a tour talking about this, which the Daily Mail got hold of and said that, you know, if you kind of running afoul of the Daily Mail, you're probably doing something right. But, you know, we were the woke brigade who was trying to, you know, dethrone Tennyson. And this is from a kind of an anonymous staff member who was obviously interviewed by the Mail. Yeah, I'm quite sure it'll be the first step to try to rename the university buildings away from the great historical figures like Tennyson to something ridiculous like the Greta Thunberg building. So there is this sense that pushback and dissent is real. It's being expressed through things like freedom of academic inquiry, the freedom of speech debate. We've got to be sensitive to that. We've obviously got to be sensitive to the legal duties that we're under. But also, we've got to try and tell a story that hopefully brings someone like our colleague here along on the journey. That this isn't about, you know, kind of, you know, wholesale historical revisionism, although that might be a nice story. But, you know, that there are kind of ways in which we can present this project as adding value, not necessarily being subtractive. So, yeah. We had this, we weren't sure we were going to spring this slide on you, so we'll wake up the Daily Mailers here.
Definitely. Okay, so in terms of what does this look like in practical terms, and I think this is obviously the most challenging piece of the work really, because we went out to different areas within the wider PPC department to gain buy-in and actually talk to people about what do you think within your area, whether you deal with recruitment, whether you deal with learning and development. whether you're more in an operational role. What kind of things do you think we might want to start looking at in terms of decolonising? People came up with some really great ideas, and I think what kind of fueled their thinking was Simon coming in and doing that kind of introduction session in the background and getting people to start thinking a little bit differently. So some of the things we've started to think about, very importantly, are around recruitment and selection. We've got a team now who their main thing is influencing across the organisation. They've got all the usual, as you can imagine, the data side, the inputting side, the admin kind of side of the role, but we're giving them a real sort of voice in how they influence across the organisation. So this is around speaking with recruiting managers around how they advertise, could be what visuals they use, what language do they use, where are they advertising, who might they be including, who might they not be including, what kind of statements are they writing. Again, when people are busy, we get people copying and pasting things out of old job descriptions that might have worked at one point in time, etc., and getting them to actually rethink these things and what do we need now at this point. A big part is the education of that team, because with 2,500 staff, we can't wave a magic wand and necessarily go out to every single recruiting manager. As much as we will do parts of that through training, what we're doing here is getting that team to have the education and actually thinking about things differently, and then how they disseminate that through conversation across the organisation. And even kind of what technology do we use in terms of people applying online? We've had these conversations. We're well aware, that disadvantages certain people, and that is a real tricky and something that we need to unpick. And again, balancing that with everything else we've got going on in terms of what technology we have set up as a function, etc. Thinking about policies and procedures, and this is difficult because a lot of that is written documents, and actually what matters is how they're conveyed and how they're translated. We are well aware of that, but equally we do need to start to unpick some of those in terms of the language. Is it inclusive? What kind of message are we saying? Does it align with the kind of wider organisational work that we want to do? So starting to look at the language. Simon's been very good at even looking at some of our policies and giving us a bit of a different view around it, things we may not have considered. We've got working groups around our policies as well, again, to bring different voices in, to say, actually, from your perspective, how does this work in reality? And some of it can be very subtle, even in terms of language, can't it?
One of the early pieces of work I did was around the performance management policy. What happens when something's going wrong with an employee, or there's kind of a disciplinary process invoked. Now, we all know that discipline is interlinked with coloniality, and how do we kind of communicate job expectations? How do we communicate all of those sorts of things, and a process that is disciplinary, but in ways that respect, the diverse backgrounds that people come from, and that contribute to, not continuing some of the harms of colonialism. How do we do that in a supportive and in an enabling way? And that's really, really challenging. This is kind of the pointy end of decolonisation. It's really easy to talk about this in kind of an abstract, theoretical point of view. How do you write a disciplinary policy that's decolonial? And I'd never really come across that challenge. But it's one that I relish, and it's fantastic that we have the opportunity to have this dialogue between the two sides of the institution.
Yeah.
Or one institution, hopefully, rather than two sides of it.
Yeah, and what's interesting is the challenge we get back when we've looked at things like appraisals and performance, and just actually saying, how does this work within different cultures, where people actually want to think of themselves as we, and working on pieces of work through co-creation and collaboration, and don't see themselves as, I've achieved this objective and I get 4 out of 4 for that. I have to balance those conversations with senior members across the university around, okay, then if we don't have ratings in and various things like that, where's your data that you can give me that can tell us what we need to do as an organisation? So it's a real balance of not saying, right, we're going to stop doing all that and take it away, but we need to unpick it, and we need to unpick how we think as individuals and what we're looking at. But there is definitely a fine balance through the work we do with all those other kind of added pressures.
How do we recognise excellence? I had a very senior member of my team come to me and say, well, I know what a 3-star or a 4-star output is, and there's an objective, statement of that, but don't give me another narrative, don't give me a story. I can't evaluate that. and sort of started to bring, well, actually, excellence can be, communicated and distributed and exhibited in different ways. But when kind of colonialism is so deeply embedded, when coloniality is so deeply embedded in the very kind of individually competitive, prestige-driven, accounts of what a career should look like, getting people to kind of step back from that is really challenging.
Definitely. And in terms of work we're doing around talent and succession, a big thing that's been very interesting and always brings about challenges is academic promotions process. So through an organisational development lens, we can do lots of work around supporting colleagues, around how you write the application, the things you need to think about, the language and the style. But what we're not doing, of course, is digging that bit deeper to actually look at how does the process work? Who does it disadvantage in terms of the language, in terms of the qualifications we're asking for various things, the experience, depending where you've come from, etc. And so it's all these things that we've started to look at. You might start to look at it through, as I say, an organisational development lens, but we've had to go back further to say, yeah, we might be doing that bit, but actually we're not resolving the bigger issue. So we continue to have many conversations around how talent and succession works. Wellbeing and engagement's one that we've started to have a look at, but again, it's gradually coming in those kind of conversations we're having. But some of the things we'd like to consider again is language, stigma around some of the things around mental health, etc. How some of our kind of engagement activities might benefit some people, might not appeal to other people, or might even disadvantage some people. Even kind of the calendars we work to in terms of time off, and how that works, etc. So
Southern Hemisphere represent over here. I want to go home during summer, not winter.
yeah, exactly. And again, it's all those things that we need to start to unpick. Learning and development is a big piece. And again, this is one that we've prioritised right from awareness and introduction and sort of trying to get our colleagues at least to a level where they have an understanding of the language and they don't fear some of the work around this. And they can see actually what we're trying to achieve, etc., and that they're absolutely part of that journey, which every single colleague is. Thinking about our new starters, so even at our Lincoln Welcome induction event, we're bringing this into that. We've got some really good videos that colleagues, including Simon, across the university have done. We're showing new starters that to get them used to some of the pieces of work, the kind of language we're using and the agendas, etc. But there's a lot that we will continue to do around that. And we've talked about kind of just lived experience part of this. In my experience of learning and development, one of the most powerful things we do with our colleagues, I think, is when we bring people in and we talk about lived experience. So we've talked about, whilst there's something around awareness and introduction and all those kind of things for some colleagues, equally getting colleagues, students, people from the local community together and just saying, let's have a conversation about this. Let's talk about some key issues under this umbrella, because obviously I would come in at it from a different lens to what you would. Our students, again, would give a different insight and just have some of those conversations. And we feel that would be very powerful. And then thinking about reward and recognition. And there's some basics that we've started to have a conversation around in terms of when you're paid. How does that work in terms of, we say, right, we get paid monthly because that's what we do, and we get paid on, the 25th of every month, and it's always worked that way. Does that work for all our colleagues? And thinking around those kind of nuts and bolts, but equally more broadly around recognition. How do we recognise colleagues? How does that sit with how people work? All our different voices, different opinions, different ways of working, even with how academics might work compared to professional services, etc. Are we making sure that we've got kind of clear pathways for people in terms of recognition, that they value and that they feel heard and recognised within? So that's kind of the background around some of the things we're starting to do. As I've said, it is such a big piece of work, but equally very exciting. And that's why we've tried to start to think about the things we want to consider, but started to really kind of prioritise them in terms of what we're going to look at initially.
So obviously we could discuss this, and I'm really keen to hear what Molly's got to contribute to the kind of this institutional kind of change progress. But we've got some three key questions that kind of really are over to you, and I think over to the sector as a whole. One of which is, where does decolonisation belong? Where does it best fit, or where does it best belong? Do we situate it as anti-racism work, which I know has been very, very much the approach here at De Montfort, kind of situating this within a kind of a lineage of kind of, anti-racist, post-Black Lives Matter, the emergence of kind of a controversy. Is it best fitted in EDI? Is it best fitted in institutional change and culture? Is it best fitted, somewhere else? What should be the scope of our ambition? Thinking about our institutional context, we're really aware of that in the Lincoln environment. But I think decolonisation looks really different if you're SOAS versus if you're the University of Lincoln versus if you're the University of Oxford. What type of institution you are, what populations you're serving, what your focus is, all of that sort of stuff. Even your governance structures. We're governed by a board of governors, in a kind of a very corporate structure. We don't have kind of a board of professors who have kind of governance responsibility for the institution. So the type of governance we have, and then how do we manage that pushback? How do we acknowledge it? How do we anticipate it and get in front of it? But once it's there, what do we do with it? And how does that feed into things like staff wellbeing and staff welfare? We're having lots of conversations in Lincoln at the moment about different groups of staff thinking about what's going on in Palestine and Gaza, but also what's going on for people who've got family in Israel. How do you manage a critique of settler colonialism within a really fraught environment like that? There are no easy answers there, but they're key questions. That's over to you. Really hope to hear what you have to say, the experience that's gathered in this room. But thank you so much for giving us the chance to talk about what we've been up to.
Yeah, thank you.